The MEI Art Gallery showcases the most exciting contemporary and modern art from the Middle East. Our current exhibit, Perceptible Rhythms, Alternative Temporalities, features 12 artists who explore the impact of conflict, urbanization, and the climate crisis on their environments. Open Monday through Friday from 10 to 5 p.m., the MEI Art Gallery is open to the public, or book your visit today at mei.edu/arts and culture center. From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief. On today's program, we'll be talking about child soldiers, recruitment and use of minors to serve in both combat and support roles in conflict. The problem is a widespread one that has a disproportionate impact on the broader Middle East, especially in countries like Yemen, Syria, and Somalia. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. To discuss this important issue, I'm joined today by two great guests, Mick Mulroy and Eric Olaric. Mick is a retired U.S. Marine, former paramilitary operations officer in the CIA's Special Activities Center, and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Eric is a retired U.S. Navy SEAL officer who last served as the commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Squadron 2. Mick and Eric are both senior fellows with MEI's Defense and Security Program and co-founders of the Lobo Institute. Especially relevant to our conversation today, they are also on the board of directors for the Grassroots Reconciliation Group, a nonprofit that seeks to help rehabilitate child soldiers, and the co-founders of End Child Soldiering, a group that seeks to end the use of children as soldiers worldwide and rehabilitate those forced to fight. Mick, Eric, welcome back to the program, and thank you both for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Alistair.
Great to be here.
Mick, to start off with, can you give our listeners a sense of how widespread the use of child soldiers is? Where are they found, and how big of a problem in particular is it in the Middle East?
Unfortunately, it is completely widespread. It's global. From the Philippines to Myanmar, where kids are routinely recruited and forced to be soldiers all the way down to the age of 12. Afghanistan, where now that the ANA is gone and the Taliban is the army, it's likely that the recruitment of children has gone up even more. To your point, in Syria, Yemen, Libya, and then throughout Africa, including Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, DRC, CAR, but all the way over to Colombia in South America. The UN has identified 14 nations that are the worst when it comes to recruiting very young children to be soldiers. And it's essentially remained very steady. With the additions of countries like Russia now and Ukraine, it is a big problem. It's a growing problem. Eric and I did a paper for Middle East Institute specifically on the Middle East. And in 2019, the UN identified that the issue had actually doubled in size in the Middle East in 1 year, which was, even among those who follow the issue, that was shocking. And right now, the UN, although it's very difficult to determine the number, the UN identifies that over 100,000 children worldwide are currently being forced into military service. And it's got to be something that we all address, and we need to do a lot better at making sure it doesn't happen.
Eric, what kind of roles do child soldiers play?
All, unfortunately. And as Mick was kind of laying out the scope of the child soldiers being used internationally, the problem is that they're used most prevalently in low-scale conflict. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing that the conflict, it isn't high-end conflict like World War II with a beginning, identified forces, middle, and a conclusion. These conflicts are just, they're kind of grinding on and on and on. I mean, I bring up the example of, Somalia, for example. It's been in conflict for over 30 years. And now those kids there, they're filling all the roles, to your question. So the boys are primarily doing the fighting and, carrying out what you deem as, kind of like an infantryman. The girls are either doing things like, battlefield care, or, even more grotesque, but widely seen, is they're put in as sex slaves. And if they're not kind of in those roles, then the girls are shoulder to shoulder with the men and they're fighting as well. So it doesn't seem as though there are areas that the kids aren't used in these ongoing low scale conflicts. And there doesn't seem to be roles that they are not allowed to do. They're being asked to carry on the fight just as the adults are that started.
Mick, why do children end up being used as combatants in the first place, and how are they kind of brought or recruited or forced to serve?
Children have always, in some capacity, served in armed conflict since antiquity. If you even look at the word infantry, it essentially comes from the same root as young, right? Infant. Traditionally, in the past, it's been in roles as a courier or something, as an aide or a person who's carrying a flag, all of which are dangerous and certainly something that we needed to get rid of. But modern times have introduced light machine guns, whether it's the AK series of rifles, the PKM, which is a automatic type weapon, and they can carry it, quite frankly, because the modern weapon has gotten lighter and lighter and more lethal. And you don't have to be, a Marine or a SEAL or what have you, a CIA guy, to carry it anymore. You can carry it as a much younger, smaller person. So that's increased the use of children as combatants, not just as carrying messages from one general to the other. Also, children, generally speaking, and some parents may disagree with this, but generally speaking, listen to adults. They just naturally follow instructions, don't question even the order to charge a hill, for example, as much as, say, an adult would, especially an adult that was forced into service. Whereas a child who is forced into service becomes very reliant on their captors, if you will. So they're very manipulable when it comes to their psychology. And because of modern weapons, they can be just as lethal on the battlefield, eat less food, quite frankly, complain less, and last longer. They're just resilient in that regard. All the good characteristics of childhood basically being used against them. And that's one of the biggest, I think, crimes here, is just how adults, which are the ones that start all these wars, have turned to using children to fight them, especially the ones that seem to go on and on and on, like the war in Yemen, for example, whereas you start with adults and you end with children. We did one documentary on a child soldier in Uganda who was in the Lord's Resistance Army, which was infamous because it not only used child soldiers, it almost exclusively used child soldiers. And it's known for essentially having abducted up to 20,000 children. I bring that up because even the one army that's known for child soldiers, when it started, it was mostly adults. And then they were quickly killed. And then they moved toward abducting children because there was not many adults left. So it's one of those things, when the wars drag out, the child soldier participation increases substantially.
Eric, what do we know about the psychological and physical toll that being a child soldier takes? What kind of an impact does it have on these children?
So, interesting question. There's kind of two scenarios with that, Alistair. First, if we go with the, kind of what was happening with the Lord's Resistance Army there in Uganda, those children were being forcefully abducted out of their homes, torn away from their families, so they weren't like dedicated to the cause. But the captors had to break that lack of dedication quickly. So what they did was they kind of just looked for opportunities to have these kids do some sort of heinous act. Now, that may be attacking, villagers in near proximity to their village that they knew and, killing them. Or it may have been some sort of documented thing where they were forcing kids to kill other kids. And what the captors are doing in that instance is they're breaking the psychological barriers that the kids have. And they're telling them that now that they're murderers, they're not welcome back into the society that they just left. So they have no choice, so you better just join us. So they're breaking down that psychological barrier that the kids have to commit into the cause. That's one scenario. The other scenario, more recently, it's well documented that in Sudan, they do not limit the age of kids that are allowed into their armed forces. So it's quite regular that you'll end up with 14-year-olds running around the ranks of the Sudanese army. With that, it's really just destitute. They don't have any other options. They're lured into fighting for Sudan because they're promised a paycheck and a meal, and therefore they are psychologically committed to it, but they are then a part of their armed forces and being used in combat roles at the age as young as 14. So those are the two kind of psychological scenarios that you mainly see with kids. And the physical toll, Mick kind of talked about it. Weaponry is lighter. It's easier for kids to be a very functioning combat infantryman or soldier with light weaponry and the things available today on the battlefield. But they get chewed up and all that. I mean, they're not impervious to it. And just like anybody else fighting war, they do get ground up and wounded in it. So, there are significant psychological and physical tolls being put forth on these kids involved in these active war-scale conflicts.
Mick, since child soldiers have this sort of dual status as both children and combatants, I'm curious how that affects how they're perceived and treated when they are eventually detained or arrested, say. How are they dealt with compared to other juveniles?
So this is a really interesting question. They are under the law, and there's been several UN protocols prohibiting the use of children as soldiers. One of them, the last one that I'm familiar with, is called OPEC, which was an optional protocol. But it mandates essentially several things. One, nation states can't use children below the age of 18. But it also says that children who were forced to fight and did atrocities, because almost all will very soon after being forced into service so that they feel like they cannot leave. They should not be given the death penalty if convicted, and they shouldn't receive a life sentence. And I think the point of that is recognizing that that individual is simultaneously a victim and a perpetrator, right? And the issue generally is if they become an adult while serving and then commit atrocities, then do you hold them responsible for that? And we had a circumstance in Uganda where Joseph Kony, who was the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army and one of the most wanted individuals in the world, his deputy essentially was apprehended. His name was Dominique Ongwen. And the individual that we actually did the documentary on knew him because he was a former child soldier. And he was the one that identified to make sure that we actually had the right person before, the White House was informed that he'd been apprehended. That was the first time I saw it being very personal because, the individual that identified him essentially said he was just a child soldier, just like any of us, except for Joseph Kony married his sister, so he decided that he would be his deputy, so to speak. And although I'm not justifying anything that he did, I think from the child soldier perspective, whereas they get rehabilitated and hopefully move on with their lives, some people were prosecuted. He was prosecuted in The Hague, and now he will serve extended time in prison. And I'm not saying that that was a wrong decision. I'm just saying that it's not as black and white as one might think. If you are abducted at 12, forced to do atrocities, that's all you know, and then you turn 18 while you're in service and you commit an atrocity, should we look at somebody who was an adult who philosophically decided to join something like, say, ISIS and then committed atrocity? I don't think so. So I think that's where the law does take that into account. And it is more complicated than one would think, but it certainly have to be viewed as both a perpetrator and a victim and treated accordingly.
Yeah, as you said, it's certainly not a black and white situation. Eric, I want to ask you now about the question of rehabilitation and reintegration of former child soldiers. That's got to be a lengthy and difficult process, especially if they've been in conflict for a long time, as Mick said with his example of somebody who's been fighting since they were 12. Or what does that process look like? How long does that take? How does that work?
You are correct, Alistair. It is a long and lengthy process. With Mick and I being involved with the Grassroots Reconciliation Group, we have had the pleasure of going back to villages in northern Uganda and seeing what that looks like, at a granular level. How does this actually play out on a personal level, and and how does that work in society? So every single one of those kids comes back with a stigma, and they do have the stigma of, you're a violent personality now, or you're damaged goods, you're a sex slave. So bringing them back into society, it does take a long time. And not only does it require that the society has to accept them back, but there's, on a personal level for the kids, they also have to be able to forgive themselves. So the blame in these things, it doesn't lie with the kids that have been forced to do these kinds of violent acts. The blame lies with the captors or the people, the adults behind it. But addressing that on a personal level is kind of the first step. And then after that, what we saw that worked well, or seemed to be working well in northern Uganda, was that they had villages that were a blend of people who had never been kind of a part of the Lord's Resistance Army or the fighting there, blended with recovering child soldiers. And, it really takes a long time, because those kids come out of the fight and they've lost the years where they were supposed to be educated. They lost the years where they were supposed to pick up some sort of, vocational thing that they could do. So the only thing that they do know is how to be soldiers. And once they have found peace with themselves, now how do you educate them, and how do you give them something to do? Become a car mechanic, become a carpenter, teach them farming. And then with that education is kind of also the continued monitoring of making sure that they are still at peace with themselves. And, we saw that things that worked well there in those blended villages were things like, it was microeconomics. It was village-based savings. And then the village could afford to buy a couple goats. And that milk and that expanded goat herd allowed them to then, branch out and get a couple larger animals, a couple oxen, things like that. But it is a multi-year process, and it does take time, and it does take dedication to do it. The fortunate thing is that a lot of times these low-scale conflicts are happening in places of the world that are poor, that are destitute. So it doesn't take a whole lot of money to have a lot of impact. That is good news side to it. Grassroots Reconciliation Group, they operate on around $50,000 a year. And, with $50,000, they're able to reach out to, not quite, 7,000 to 8,000 kids that they're helping work through this process and bring them back into society. So it is long and it is laborious, but they absolutely can come back, and they absolutely do have good roles to fill in society.
I'm curious about the other side of the equation, kind of moving from the individual level to the sort of macro societal level. In these kind of contexts where you have kind of a widespread number of youth who've been exposed to violent trauma, like fighting in a war, what does that sort of mean for that society? What does that look like? That kind of dynamic as well.
So I think there's two factors. One is just the humanitarian factor that I would argue, and I think, from as much time we spent on the subject talking to other people, that adults generally agree that children shouldn't be fighting wars, and that's a human right for them not to be required to do so in general, just because it's the moral and ethical thing to do. The other part of it is it does affect everybody's national security. And what I mean by that is if you take the current prisoner camps and the IDP camps in Syria, especially the IDP camps, many of those children are the children of former ISIS fighters. In fact, probably a great large majority of them are. They're only hearing one philosophy, if you will, the very distorted, toxic philosophy of ISIS. If nothing changes, when they get old enough to travel, there's nothing keeping them there because they've essentially haven't done anything. They were kids. So this is a version of child soldier, I would say. And of course, the ones that were actually, as children, forced to fight for ISIS, which is known for that as well, and being incarcerated. When they're let out, if they're not rehabilitated, like Eric was talking about, where they're given psychological counseling and they're given a vocation that they can actually do something with, to start a family and do things that people would want to do, they could easily be the next generation of terrorists. So it's not just the right thing to do, in general. It's also the right thing to do for national security. And that could be the case, not just in places like Syria, where they could go out and be the next attacker in Paris or New York City or something like that, but also in countries where they end up living. It's like PTSD for a soldier times 10, because they're so young and so manipulated that they didn't have the maturity in the first place to deal with what they saw. And then, of course, not a lot of people do much to reintegrate them into society. So they become kind of a ticking time bomb, even internal to their country. So people should, I think, care about this, not just for the right thing to do, that should be, quite sufficient, but also because you don't want, they could be the next ISIS, Al-Qaeda attacker. They could be the next shooter in a mass shooting because they didn't receive the kind of psychological counseling they should and are essentially given another vocation. So they don't have one option in life, which is to become, go from a child soldier to an adult soldier in either a militia or a terrorist organization. So I think there's a lot of reasons for the international community to care about this issue and to do more than just sign protocols, but to actually enforce protocols, enforce and push countries to join the protocols that currently exist in the UN.
Eric, just building on what Mick just said, what would it take to do that, to get countries that haven't signed up to sign up, and kind of more importantly, I suppose, to make sure that those regulations actually have some teeth so that there is sort of enforcement as well?
So, Alistair, I kind of painted that it was a little bit of a good news thing that these conflicts happen in poor countries, and it doesn't take a lot of money to kind of help have a large impact. This is also a good news aspect of this topic, which is whether it's state actors that are using kids in combat, like Sudan, or whether it's non-state actors that are using kids in combat. Non-state actors are usually receiving aid of some sort from a state. There's typically states that are using them in some way, shape, or form. So the ability to either use sanctions or the ability to use aid money or the ability to do things like that through the states can have impact on state and non-state actors that are using kids as soldiers. It can be done, and that to me means that you have the ability to sway impact. You can make it painful for those that would be prone to using kids as soldiers on them. And you can do it, through the existing government structures. We give out aid every year as the U.S. The UN votes on aid and programs all the time. So, the very first UN Security Council resolution was number 1261, and it was signed in August 1999. And that was, the first time it was condemning the targeting of children in armed conflict. And since then, we've had a number of either US or other UN resolutions that have tried to get at this. But honestly, the way to put teeth to it is to the wallet. Just do it through the money that we send to either countries and they need to amend their behavior, whether it be their own actions or the actions that they're using to support a non-state actor. That's the way to actually have true and large-scale impact on this.
Mick, wanted to get your perspective on the issue too, and specifically on the U.S. legislation that Congress passed about 15 years ago, which is the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, which is aimed at doing precisely what Eric was just saying, kind of withholding certain types of military assistance from governments that use children or supporting militias that do so. How effective do you think that legislation has been?
So I think it has been effective. It could be more effective, but it's important to point out it's one of the most significant laws passed on the issue itself. And it was passed essentially with complete bipartisan support, which is not a common occurrence. So it is very significant, and essentially outlaws being in charge of an army that uses child soldiers. It prevents the sale of weapons and security assistance to countries that are identified, and they're mostly identified in the State Department's human trafficking report and human rights reports. The countries that were prohibited unless we pass an exception, unless a president does an exception. I can talk a little bit about that. And it's pretty significant when it comes to the U.S. assistance to countries that have been identified. So it is important. It was passed in 2008. So if we provided waivers that keep happening, I think it would be more effective. And what I mean by that is, I understand the argument, even somebody who's close to the issue as, Eric and myself are. I understand that our participation in a country, providing them security assistance to help fight a common enemy like, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, makes sense. I think by us forcing them to have a plan to stop using child soldiers with continued assistance that inspires them to do that, I understand why some of the waivers are passed. The problem is when you have a country that's gotten waivers over and over and over again, although they have a plan to stop using child soldiers, don't seem to be following it. That's when I think the United States needs to enforce their own law and not give waivers to countries that not only are using child soldiers, but continue to, even though they've agreed with a plan to stop. So I think it's very significant, and it will be probably the prime method used to reduce the use of children around the world if we are more, I think, smart when it comes to its application of exemptions.
Eric, I wanted to ask you as well, and you've both kind of touched on this in different points during our conversation, but you are involved in several organizations that focus on this issue specifically. If you wanted to kind of maybe elaborate a little bit more on your work and kind of like what you're trying to achieve in doing that. Just wanted to kind of get a little bit more of the personal perspective on this.
So we laid out the legislation. Honestly, this topic gets support from both sides of the aisle in the U.S., and this topic also gets support quickly on the international level. So it really just comes down to awareness. I think that, some tools that probably need to be leveraged a bit harder, whether it's in DC, in think tanks, in political circles, or within the administration, it's the media. It's an awareness issue. So leverage the media. And that is a tack that Mick and I have taken on this topic. Making the documentary about those two child soldiers, one male, one female, from the Lord's Resistance Army is now being written into a book. That book should be out here in the spring of 2024, published by Amazon. But it will absolutely highlight the issue through a human story. I think that people will be able to walk in the footsteps of these two child soldiers and live and visualize and see what their life was like, which should raise the awareness quite a bit. If we bring it home here a little bit, I'll talk specifically about the looming issue of kids in the Middle East. 54,000 residents at the Al-Hol refugee camp there in northern Syria. Half of them are under the age of 12. So just call it 25,000 kids. Most of their fathers were killed as part of us getting rid of ISIS, the international coalition. They have a sense of abandonment by the international community. They aren't being taken care of in those camps and taught vocational things or giving anything productive for their future. So what do we think is going to happen with those 25,000 kids that are now 12 that are going to hit 18 in 6 years. We have generations of kids here that are living the same cycle that we've seen in all these other low scale conflicts. They don't have much of a future. Do we think that they're not going to trend toward extremism? Personally, I would be very amazed if they don't, because we're almost giving them no other option. We can go a little bit further with that, and we can go into, all right, well, how about the males that we have in the SDF facilities in permanent incarceration? We have no due process for them. They come from all nationalities. They're being held by a state that we don't recognize. How are we going to bring those guys back into society in a healthy manner? We have no judicial process to either hold them accountable as murderers, or we have no judicial process to say, hey, you know what? You actually didn't commit war crimes, and here's a pipeline to recovery, and you're going to come back into society as a productive member. Instead, we've got both men, women, and a large bulk of kids, whether it's in detention facilities or in these camps, that are with no end in sight, just held in perpetuity. So that, to me, is a significant problem that has to be dealt with at an international level, but it just doesn't seem like we can get organized on.
Absolutely, definitely a problem that no one seems to want to deal with, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't need dealing with. We're running a bit short on time, but before we wrap up, wanted to get both of your final thoughts, and I guess one last question as well to prime you. What is one thing that you'd like to see change that would really move the needle when it comes to addressing this issue?
Sure. The international community, we have to get better at what comes after we stop dropping bombs, or what comes after the signing of a truce. We need to get better at that step after the conflict is kind of over, and actually have a plan for those that have been caught up in that conflict, especially the kids, because you can see it. The kids are being used more and more and more, but there isn't any solid plan ahead for how do you bring them back out of combat. And combat is something that warps you, and combat is something that requires everything you have just to live through it. So I think that as an international community, we have to be aware of it, and we have to decide that it's important. That'd be the one thing that I think we need to move the needle on.
Obviously, totally agree with that. I think I'll break it down into three components. The first is stop creating the circumstances that create the need for child soldiers. And we can see this burgeoning up right now in Sudan. If we can't get a ceasefire that holds and get back on track to selecting a civilian government in which the military there supports, this could turn into a protracted civil war in which many, many kids are used as soldiers and killed, right? Sudan's already on the list. And one of the factions there, the RSF, is known for having an abundance of children in their ranks. The second thing we talked a little bit about already, the Child Soldier Prevention Act. I do understand that the U.S. being involved with a country can help it improve its human rights, not just child soldiers, but human rights in general. But we need to ensure that it's actually doing that. So if we require a country to get on a plan to eliminate its use of child soldiers to be able to continue to get U.S. security assistance, we need to follow through on it. And if they can't and they don't, then they should not be benefited by that. So I think that's the other thing. And last is where we focus a lot, whether it's Grassroots Reconciliation Group, which is focused on the LRA in Uganda, which is largely a failed insurgency and over, but GRG has done great work and rehabilitated a lot of people, and I think is now a model for that type of activity. And then we created End Child Soldiering, which is an NGO that, as Eric says, is going to be at least partially funded by the sale of the book that's based on our documentary. But we're going to focus that internationally, and we're going to focus on groups that are on the ground doing real rehabilitative work to teach kids a new skill. We're not going to stop every child soldier, so we have to have a plan to address that issue and to get them back into society psychologically and, vocationally. And that is something that people can get involved in. Unfortunately, these happen in countries that are developing in quite frankly, to the groups in those countries that are the most impoverished. So a little bit goes a long way, to be frank, when it comes to rehabilitating these kids. And there's other groups, and In Child Soldiering is our group, but there's, if you remember the Hotel Rwanda movie, the UN general in that has started one, Romeo Dallaire, has got an institute that still is functioning all throughout Africa. And I think that's the three biggest things we can do to really change the trajectory of children being forced in growing numbers to be in the wars that are happening all around the world.
And for people who want to know more about the work that you're doing through End Child Soldiering, I presume they should check out the Lobo Institute website.
Yes, and End Child Soldiering has a website too.
Okay, we'll include those in the episode description as well, so everyone knows where to go if they're interested in learning more. I think that's all we have time for today. But Mick, Eric, thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for your time, Alistair.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you again to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can find all of our latest coverage of regional issues on our website at www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.